Okay, now for something completely different. I want to tell you that I'm really grateful that Omar spoke today about microbiology, genetics, epigenetic expression, and translation into neural networks, because I've spent the last 2 nights chopping most of the science out of this paper so that I could simply make a case to you. I'm a philosopher of science by training, and so I'm going to talk to you today about the use of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So the claim here is, first of all, for simplicity, I'm going to speak only about treatment with classical hallucinogens, because we know like MDMA works slightly differently, and so I'm not taking into account all of those, just the major studies that have been done, about a dozen of them, on psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, and particularly with respect to depression in late-stage cancer patients, also with intractable depression otherwise, and there have been several studies on addiction, also studies with respect to OCD and PTSD, right? So this is sort of the limiting cases where the research has gone on so far. So, an examination of the last decade's worth of research reveals that profound and lasting effects of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy can only really be understood completely in terms of changes in a variety of interacting genetic, neural, psychological, semantic codes. And in the very fact that this present surge in this research is happening is a result of course, social codes. Today, I'm going to outline several of the many, many levels and kinds of coding changes this therapy involves, and show how those various types of psychedelic treatment are all providing a part of the explanation of how just 1 or 2 sessions with psychedelic-assisted therapy can result in the 70% preponderance of these patients bringing about profound and lasting results. And so typically with chronic treatment with pharmaceuticals, we get at best a 30% remission of symptoms in these cases. However, in the psychedelic treatments, they're regularly getting across big studies at NYU, University of Colorado, Stanford, and now Johns Hopkins has opened an institute. Actually, University of Colorado Denver has opened another institute for the study of this kind of treatment because of the surprising level of success that it's been having in the cases so far. So the way I'm going to organize this is, instead of trying to go talk to you from the molecular level to the cellular level to the network level or something all the way up to psychological and semantic levels, I'm gonna talk through it in the narrative format of a typical therapeutic treatment session. Okay, so in any given treatment session, even before the psychedelics are administered, psychological codes are involved. By this, I mean that the set and setting, or the psychological intention of the patient, and the physical setup of the environment are actually crucial to the success of these treatments. So the patient's prepared for the dosing session in days or weeks prior, generally over several meetings of some hours with a team of 2 psychotherapists or 1 psychiatrist. In these sessions, the patients are informed of what they can expect during the experience, the meanings of the particular physiological responses that they might have during parts of the certain phases of the process, such as anxiety as one becomes induced under the hallucinogens or psychedelics. And they teach them the meaning of those physiological responses and give them methods for managing them. Patients are also informed of the importance of avoiding resisting the experience and discuss the value of letting go of defenses while being assured of continuous support throughout this experience. The degree to which the patient is able to let go of ego control has been robustly correlated with the effectiveness and the positivity of the experience. I'll return to that later. In addition, in virtually every clinical study, the therapeutic setting is important. Now, there are some MRI studies, some fMRI studies, and some EEG studies that they do, which obviously is not going to involve set and setting. They're just watching what happens at the cellular, at the neural level, right, in those cases. And then they will, those are separate kinds of studies. But typically in the therapeutic studies, the room is dimly lit and comfortable. The patient's lying down or maybe seated on a reclining chair, again with those two trusted attendants. Eyes are covered so that the attention is turned toward the mind's own representations rather than to the external perceptual changes that, well, obviously are going to distract us. Classical psychedelics induce visual hallucinations because the visual cortex is heavily populated with 5-HT2A receptors. And so eye masks are used so that spontaneous hallucinations that are created by the visual cortex are maximally free to be associated with memories and emotions and thoughts. Finally, music is played with a distinct progression to suggest a direction of the patient's experience. Where it might seem just to be an ancillary detail, like additional decor or something, music is a powerful evocator of emotion and memory, and it plays a central role in psychedelic therapy, not only for calming effects at various stages I mentioned, but also for its ability to act synergistically with the drug to guide and potentially enhance emotional experiences and to bring memories to the forefront and other associations. Once the psychedelic substance has been administered, several kinds of organic codes come into play. Psychedelics create their effects by acting as agonists on the serotonin HT2A receptors. These receptors are a kind of G-protein coupled receptor, which is the largest group of signal transducers across the cell, consisting of thousands of different proteins, each of which is highly specific to a distinct signal. The 5-HT molecule, also known as serotonin, acts, generally as either a hormone, a transmitter, a neurotransmitter, or a neuromodulator. And in this case, it acts as a neuromodulator. So the 5-HT2A receptors, the relevant ones, and not all hallucinogens do attach to 5-HT2A receptors, and not everything that attaches to 5-HT2A receptors does result in hallucinogenic factors, but the 5-HT2A receptor is an essential factor in creating the hallucinogenic effect. So these receptors, because of their extensive location in the areas of the central nervous system primarily involved with cognitive function and social interaction, such as the cortex, the hippocampus, basal ganglia, and the forebrain, are believed to be involved in such disorders as OCD, depression, and addiction, which is why they ended up being the most studied of afflictions. So the question then becomes how psychedelic therapy works to alleviate these symptoms. Serotonergic hallucinogens act as 5-HT2A receptor agonists with high affinity, causing those receptors to remain in their active states for a prolonged period. These receptors are expressed most densely in levels 1, 2, and 5A of the cortex. The default mode network, to which we'll return below, and the one that is absolutely key in this treatment, includes regions that are unusually rich in the 5-HT2A receptors. EEG and MEG observations of brains under large doses of 5-HT2A agonists show entropic effects, maybe not, we'll talk about, but disarray effects across the corticostriatothalamic loop. The result is that diminished thalamic filtering and increased overall cortical excitability, which means that the brain functions much less modular way than usual. And there are cases of synesthesia in these, under the influence of these, so you see that the modules are sort of weakened. Scans of brains under the influence of psychedelics show associations across brain regions and lowered synchronized neural oscillations in the posterior cingulate cortex in particular. That's important because it's a particularly highly active and densely connected region that's been dubbed by several researchers the core node of the default mode network. The suppression of organizing networks and the excitation of cortical-wide associations means that brains under the influence of psychedelics look much more like the brains of a 4-year-old than brains of a trained adult. The explanatory power of the suppressive effects of the psychedelic mode, of the default mode network, and also the salience network, which is another intrinsic connectivity in network, is impressive with respect to how psychedelics function in psychotherapy, and it tracks closely with study subjects' personal reports. The default mode network, which is centered on such cortical midline structures as the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, and it's associated with autobiographical memory, displays high levels of activity during wakeful, non-task-directed rest, but also during self-referential, metacognitive, and socially oriented tasks. It remains relatively quiet, though, when subjects are involved in task-related intellectual activity. An important 2022 multimodal study published by Robin Carhart-Harris reported that lasting changes in the structure and the function of the default mode network correlated with robust antidepressant effects. This study, focused on patients with treatment-resistant depression, found distinct patterns of increased activity and connectivity within the default mode network post-treatment. In general, this is weird because in general, heightened default mode network activity and connectivity have been found to be correlated with depressive symptoms. But these trials suggested that in the case of psychedelic treatment, it isn't simply a matter of upregulating or downregulating activity. Rather, it's the specific patterns of signaling that make the difference. Likewise, evidence from the same cohort showed that with respect to the salience network, patients exhibited increased amygdala activity when shown emotional faces, and this is a day after the psilocybin. And this increase correlated with antidepressant effects measured a week later. Now, interestingly, again, right, this is in contrast with the operation of SSRIs, which is the typical prescribed treatment. Those drugs decrease amygdala activity with respect to emotional stimuli. So this suggests that psychedelics may be operating completely differently from SSRIs in reducing depression, and that hypothesis is actually confirmed by the subjective reports of the patients who had experience of both. SSRIs, on the one hand, seem to mask the symptoms of depression, whereas the psychedelic-assisted treatment seems to work by helping patients to confront the psychological causes of fear and depression, reframing, reassociating their emotional difficulties in novel ways. In OCD, addiction, and depression and anxiety, experienced associations become predicted associations which, through long-term potentiation, began, of course, to act like attractor wells, which result in automated, seemingly unbreakable associations, constraining other possibilities. In short, brains become stuck in ruts of their own making. These ruts seem to be softened through changes created in the default mode network and the salience network, and the resulting reconsolidated networks seem to include more productive, adaptive signaling patterns. This returns us to the importance of the set and setting of a supportive, thoughtfully conceived therapeutic context in which the suppression of the default mode network, that is one's normal sort of way of processing everything, one's identity, one's personal way of filtering, and the salience networks, and then their subsequent reconsolidation are guided. Simply scrambling up things is not going to help anything. You can do that by falling on your head. It doesn't, right? The point is not that. The point is that certain networks, central networks, be depressed so that subsequently they will reconsolidate themselves in more adaptive ways. The research cited so far has led to a consensus view among researchers or a primary explanation of how psychedelics work in alleviating depression and the other things. And that, of course, is neuroplasticity. This plasticity may happen in any one or all three of the following ways. First, it's well documented that psychedelics stimulate synthesis of BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, and activation of its target TRKB receptor. So there's some evidence that neurogenesis in the dentate gyrus area of the hypothalamus could have an effect. But this effect would have to be really small, though, because in adults, neurogenesis wouldn't be enough to actually produce a noticeable difference. The second way that psychedelics might be having their effect is through strengthening and weakening existing neural connections, and that clearly happens at least during the period of dose administration. Third way, though, in which plasticity might be operating is through the addition of novel connections in the cortex, between the cortex and the thalamus and other subcortical regions. Mouse models show that administration of psychedelics results in growth of apical dendrites and dendritic spines in pyramidal cells that persist for long periods of time, months, in mice, which you know is a long time in mice years. These points of potential connection create opportunities for ongoing forging of new neural connections. Of some interest, I guess, in with regard to this, is that imaging in patients suffering from depression, which is characterized by self-focus, inability to disengage from referential, ruminative, repetitive thought, is connected to a reduction in dendritic spines. So these are naturally dying dendritic spines. This converges with the point made above regarding networks coming to act as attractor wells, with the lack of novel connections playing a significant role, right, in those kinds of repetitive, ruminative afflictions. Now, philosophically, this leaves us with a problem about how to interpret the import of these plasticity effects. At least a couple of candidate interpretations are on offer. One is to think that new experiences incited by hallucinogens cause transformational changes, and just in the same ways that other peak experiences can cause transformational differences, like having children, or coming near death, or flying into space or something, right? That could really cause, just on the psychological level, transformational differences. On that kind of read, the psychological experience is just the catalyst. The psychedelic experience is just the catalyst for changes that the brain makes on its own. And the important work is done at the more top-down psychological level. On this view, the chemical and the neural signaling simply realize or instantiate the therapeutic psychological work of recoding past experiences and emotional responses. On another way of thinking about it, though, the neuroplasticity thesis conflicts with traditional psychological accounts. According to this interpretation, sometimes called the pure neuroplasticity theory, for obvious reasons, the effects of the psychedelic experience are actually just the result of signaling at the molecular and the neural levels. So from that pure neuroplasticity point of view, one group of effects is understood to be as a set of transient effects brought about by brain-wide changes in information processing, while the real work of the drug is at the molecular and the cellular levels. In other words, the pure neuroplasticity view says that psychological experience itself is purely epiphenomenal, a side effect of the strong agonistic influence that the drug has on those 5-HT2A receptors. Some labs are really interested in this because that would open the possibility for developing pharmaceuticals that, if they worked, could bring about the lasting changes that people are seeing in the psychedelic treatments without the psychotomimetic, as they call it, right? Without the psychotic mimetic effects happening. But that latter view, that pure neuroplasticity view, conflicts with the self-reports of hundreds of research subjects who speak nearly univocally about the centrality to the lasting effects of their treatment to the phenomenological experience itself. The most robust predictor of responses to psychedelic therapy, in fact, is the ratings that are given by test subjects on psychometric scales of the degree to which they have had some sort of mystical type experience in their sessions. These are experiences in which a subject feels being endlessly expansive, a phenomenon sometimes described as oceanic boundlessness, being at one with everything, or experiencing what some philosophers and psychologists will call ontic reality. So this kind of phenomenal experience requires, but it's not identical with, what's commonly called ego dissolution. Ego dissolution comes in many flavors, sometimes in a dissociation between one's mind and its contents, or between one's past experiences and the emotional valence of those experiences, or sometimes as a loss of agency over thought. None of these kinds of experiences, I want to say, are necessarily pleasant, but even challenging journeys, or what was called maybe in the 60s bad trips, can end in long-lasting benefits. However, as mentioned above, the best results are seen in those patients who have positive experiences of letting go of the ego's control. And that letting go of the ego's control is measured on a standard scale on the morning of dosing, and is strongly correlated with positive therapeutic effects. Now, there are some social coding-based objections to this kind of therapy. For instance, some claim that it causes people to have metaphysical hallucinations, and that is ontic reality perception, right, in which they believe they've seen another realm. This objection, called the comforting delusion objection, it's a kind of an ethical objection, and I got answers to that. I'm not going to bring them up here, but I'll talk to you about them later if you like. In any case, I didn't come here to talk about whether or not one ought to, or when, or how administer or seek psychedelic-assisted therapies. My observation, instead, is simply that the phenomenon, whether followed from the bottom up, from the molecular and cellular levels, or from the top down, focusing on the psychological phenomena of a recentered sense of self and transformed ways of understanding one's history, one's relationships to others and the world, the mechanisms operating in this kind of therapy depend essentially on meanings. From the psychological perspective of the patient, when one's sense of self is relocated with respect to their semantic world, the meanings and salience of innumerable other things, and I actually, because of my view of semantics, would say everything else, is also changed. Healing with psychedelics is at this level a process of recoding ordinary and/or traumatic emotions, events, people, places. The drug provides the catalyst by allowing for the ego that's at the center of all meanings to be diminished and then reintegrated in a novel way. The point is, whether the signaling is at the physical, psychological, or semantic level, the mechanisms of operation in psychedelic-assisted therapy is all about signaling and meaning.
One short question. Thank you.
Did I personally test this out? Is everywhere we're going?
Were there any side effects on circadian rhythms in animals or humans?
Never, I mean, none noted in humans. Well, I don't know that anybody's looked, because typically what I've seen are in animal studies. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe somebody can do that work.
Yeah, I don't know whether they tested it in patients or asked them.
Yeah, I wouldn't ask them, like, are you sleeping now? I don't know.
So we have here some questions.
Candice, thank you for your excellent talk. But if possible, I would to know your ideas about a quotation from Jung. Jung, in his letters, once said about Aldous Huxley experiences, he writes, that is the mistake Aldous Huxley makes. He does not know that he is in the role of who learned from his master how to call the ghosts, but did not know how to get rid of them again. Can you?
Okay, so I'm not used to listening to Jung's diction. So say it one more time. So he says that Huxley has it wrong because he mistakes.
Because it invokes ghosts.
It invokes ghosts. Okay.
Metaphorical way, of course.
Yeah.
But it can breathe out again.
Oh, that they can come out again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and so where if you went through Jungian psychoanalysis, then the ghost would be disappeared forever. Is that what he's saying? Is that what his argument? Is that what Jung is saying? I don't know what Jung is saying. Is that what he's saying?
What can be the problem is the ego complex can be destroyed because of that ghost. If you are amplifying by this type of psychedelics the force of unconscious, you can destroy the ego complex. And if you are not guided, that's why we use psychotherapy in this type of approach. If you don't do that, maybe you can be in very dangerous position. That's why.
Yeah, okay, two things then. One is there are 0 cases of anybody losing their mind or losing their sense of identity and anybody who's been studied formally. But 2, the kind of use of psychedelics that I'm talking about here is in where I said very crucially, right? The set and setting are absolutely essential.
And in very hard situations, in the very punctual in hard situations like profound depression and so on. Where you need to activate some type of unconscious state for the person can have some process to work by. Maybe I can explain this in a question that I have to you. We like a lot to talk about it. And you spoke about the increased activity of the amygdala, which acts as a regulator of emotions, which in the right amygdala specifically regulate the negative emotions, okay? An interesting study conducted by Andrew Newberg found that an increased activity in the right amygdala affects the ability for metaphor in the certain experiences because the information did not flow to the angular gyros. And the angular gyros is known as the center of the metaphor. It seems to me that some types of psychedelics like ayahuasca, and maybe you know about it, increase the dopamine activity and therefore increase the activity of world exploration centers. It appears that in some ways psychedelics can be an exploration amplifier for exploration the meaning in a person's life, correct? Because when you talk in this type of situation of very profound depressions, you need something like a microphone to amplify the connection between the ego complexes and between the mind states that you are not related by.
But I can say that dopamine levels are upregulated in the case of classic hallucinogens as well. So maybe that would help, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think so. So. Of course, this need to be controlled and so on.
Absolutely.
But it seems like a new pathway that if we can integrate some very good conceptualizations like Jung do, maybe we have here a pathway. Logically, it's not a pathway for everyone because in some sense, I don't like the expression of normal people.
Yeah. On the other hand, though,
but in regular people, you if you do this, can be very dangerous because. And serotonin control.
Does it? Or are you asking me?
Yes.
What are the measurements? Are you asking me that? Yeah. Because one of the things I wanted to say, first of all, right. So this research is very controlled, right? This research has only been funded well for like the last 10 years maybe, only in a really robust way for maybe the last 5 years. And so one thing that has been an excluder of anyone from a clinical trial is schizophrenia, either in the person or at even a close relative will get you excluded from. And this is because of the problems I think that you're talking about. So those people will, I mean, for the purposes of controlling the experiment, right, would automatically be excluded from the trials. So that wouldn't come up as a problem.
Of course.
Yeah.
I have a curiosity. How do you select the music? Because I think this is important.
Yeah. So let me tell you.
You have to tailor the music on the subject, no?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, there's a general kind of patterning that they use. And so the kind of patterning that they use is they begin with open, airy kind of ambient music that it has basically no structure. It's, maybe elevator, I don't know, but it's sort of an ambient music. And then a couple, I don't know what happens in elevators, but the couple, and so then after a couple of hours into the session, it changes gently into something with some percussion, with some rhythm. And then after another hour or so, they will add in nature sounds, some birds, some, whatever else kind of naturescape kinds of sounds. And then even at the end, some voices, typically female voices, and chanting kind of sounds until the person is, parachuting out. Yeah. So the idea is that there is a structure to the journey that the person undertakes, and they keep that the same for everybody. Yeah, all the time.
Yeah. So we have here a last question.
Candice, thank you for your lecture. It was very amusing. I wonder that, you mentioned the studies focusing on the default mode network and the salient network, but there are other networks in the brain, and I don't know if when they relate this, like lowering the modularity of the brain means that they the brain they are using less circuits, and if they are
using less, what was the other? I missed a word.
When you mentioned the modularity is lowering. Yeah. For me the modulars are the circuits, so the circuits are like kind of off or getting off, and then means that we having like brain, or we can relate it to brain states difference that we tend to be in.
Yeah, exactly. So, once you have the salience network, that thalamic striatum loop kind of dissolving, it's disrupted, then the filtering practices that would normally create sequences, create the way in which we process things, that also dissipates for the period of time that one is under. It's usually 4 to 6 hours, under this treatment. But yeah, and that somehow is also it's important. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thank you for not dying.
Thank you, Candice.